Welcome back to Effortless Website Design. In Unit 2, you were introduced to the markup language HTML and its primary functions. In this unit, Unit 3, you will be introduced to CSS and what creative possibilities it opens up for your website design. We'll also learn about CSS and where it fits into the website design process. Let's begin. CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, is a style sheet language developed to control the appearance of markup language documents, such as HTML. Most web developers and designers prefer to use HTML to control the structure of the website and use CSS for the display. By separating presentation and structure, you have more control when making design changes. CSS is not a markup language such as HTML or a scripting language like Java. Style sheets are a collection of formatting rules contained in external files that can control a single document or an entire website. The cascade refers how these styles are applied to pages or documents. Styles are applied in the order that they are found, cascading down from external to local styles. Styles can be located in different positions. We will refer back to this later on in the video. The benefit of using CSS in your website design becomes highly apparent in modularized website design. Approaching all website design in a modularized fashion is advantageous in many respects. Locating issues, writing code when making changes, and when multiple developers and designers are working on a project, it's much easier when the documents are streamlined in this way. Say, for example, a team of developers are creating a website. All document structure is contained with HTML. CSS determines the look and feel of the site. JavaScript handles the behavior within the browser. PHP controls the processing and business logic, and MySQL is used to store content in databases. This modular approach means you can change each one independently of each other. Some websites use all of them, whilst others utilize only HTML and CSS. It depends on the complexity of the website which coding languages will be used. Another advantage of CSS is its ability to override the various default styles inherent of web browsers. Why would the web browsers contain their own default styles, you might ask? In case you didn't know, every browser has its own default user agent style sheet that it uses to make unstyled websites appear more legible. For example, most browsers, by default, make links blue and visited links purple. It gives tables a certain amount of border and padding, apply variable font sizes to heading 1, heading 2, and heading 3, and so forth, and a certain amount of padding to almost everything. Ever wondered why submit buttons look different in every browser? Obviously, this creates a certain amount of headaches for CSS authors who can't work out how to make their websites look the same in every browser. Using a CSS reset, CSS authors can force every browser to have all its styles reset to null, thus avoiding cross-browser differences as much as possible. A CSS reset is a short, often compressed set of CSS rules that resets the styling of all HTML elements to a consistent baseline. Most elements that are affected are margin, padding, font size, and line height. An example of a CSS reset could look like this. Some people claim that this is unnecessary, that there's no sense resetting an element's style, only to unreset it afterwards. If you did a close-up on one element, with a CSS reset and then further styling, the issue becomes clear. It duplicates effort and processing time, when a single declaration could have sufficed. Many developers and designers feel that this violates the don't repeat yourself principle and prefer not to use it. The syntax of CSS differs from HTML. If you can remember from Unit 2, HTML consists of tags. Most of them work in pairs in angle brackets. CSS uses only curly braces. As seen in the example rule, CSS syntax consists of two parts, a selector and a declaration. Inside the declaration, the property and value is specified. The selector indicates to the browser which element or elements to style. In the example, it specifies that all paragraph tags in the HTML documents need to be styled as follows. Selectors can also be complex, and they can specify more in-depth which elements to style. They can also be grouped together or combined for more precise targeting. The declaration is specified in between the curly braces. It indicates the formatting instructions for that style. In the example, there are two rules, one indicating which font family to utilize and the other which size to display it as. The rules are made up of two parts, the property and value. They are separated by colons and use a semicolon to stop evaluating and move on to the next rule. The property indicates which is to be transformed by the CSS style, and the value specifies the amount or size. You will need to learn the rules in terms of what can be styled and which values are applicable. In the sample rule we've looked at, the selector targeted a HTML element. There are various ways that selectors can be allocated. It depends on what purpose you have for it. In some, you'd want a comprehensive style applied across the website. In other situations, you might want to target a smaller number of elements or a single element. Understanding how selectors work will allow you to do just that. There are three basic selector types. The first type we'll discuss is the element selector. Element selectors are universal in character, meaning they are going to affect every element of that type in a style document. All you need to know is the tag of the element you wish to style. In a CSS style sheet, you only need to name the tag. Unlike HTML, we don't need the angle brackets around the tag name, just the tag itself. For example, to style paragraphs, you'd use the P. For headings, you'd use, for example, an H1. For unordered list, you'd use an UL, and so on. Element selectors are very efficient, but also very broad. That is why they are mostly used to set site-wide styles. The second basic selector type is a class selector. Classes are HTML attributes that can be set on any HTML element. You can name a class anything you want, and you can use it on as many elements and as many times on the page as you need. If we look at the following example, you can understand why classes are such a favorite. Here, the browser would look through all the elements on the page and apply styling to any elements with a class attribute of subheading. Notice the full stop in front of the word subheading. Class selectors are identified through the full stop. You will also notice the spelling of the property color. CSS is written in American English, and only American English is recognized. Thus, color would be spelled as C-O-L-O-R. For other English speakers, you'd need to be aware of that. Be meticulous in your spelling, as CSS is case sensitive. Thus, CSS won't recognize the word body spelled with capital B and body spelled with lowercase b as the same name selectors, since the first is spelled with the capital and the second with a lowercase. The third basic selector is called an ID selector. ID selectors are similar to class selectors in that they represent a HTML attribute. They are unlike in one distinct aspect. IDs must be unique to the page, which means that when you assign an ID to a page element, no other element on that page may have that specific ID allocated to it. In this example, the browser would find the element on the page that has the ID attribute of sidebar and then apply the styling. IDs are identified by the pound symbol in front of the ID name. You can also make class and ID selectors element-specific by adding an element to the front of the selector. This limits the styling to only elements with the specific class or ID assigned to it. For example, here, styling would only be applied to headings 2s with a class of subheading. And the second rule, here, the ID of sidebar will only be applied to diffs on that page. This allows you to write a single general class or ID style and then follow that with a more focused element-specific style, if necessary. Classes and IDs can be anything you want them to be, but you do need to follow some naming conventions. 1. Don't use any spaces. 2. Don't use any special characters. 3. Remember CSS is case sensitive. And 4. Establish standards for your CSS and be consistent. Another type of selector I'd like you to take note of is the descendant selector. Descendant selectors allow you to target an element based on where it's found within another element. You just string these selectors together, separating them with a white space. The parent selectors are added first, followed by each successive nested selector. In this example, the browser would find any span elements inside of all paragraph elements, which were also inside of div elements. There is no limit to the amount of elements you can string together, but more than 3 become ineffective. You can see in example 1, the browser would locate any paragraph found within a div tag and style it red. In example 2, the browser will locate all span elements located inside paragraphs elements which are nested in div tags. Descendant selectors allow you to be exceedingly specific. Another thing I want to point out here is that the descendant selectors apply to any nested element, no matter how deep it's found within the document structure. Going back to the first example, it's going to apply paragraphs inside the div, not just one that are immediately inside the div. You can also group selectors together by using commas between the selectors themselves. This can make writing styles more efficient by grouping selectors together that need the same kind of styling. Instead of writing 3 separate selectors like this, for example, you can simply write one group selector, and that is a lot more efficient. Although there are certainly many more selector types available than the ones shown here, the overwhelming bulk of your styles will probably be written through the basic selector types that's been covered. Learning how to write efficient selectors based on your document structure is among the most important CSS skills that you can cultivate. By mastering the different types of selectors available, you'll find that you have a much broader set of options for writing effective styles. It's difficult to understate how important HTML and CSS are to web design. Since both languages have syntax that is relatively easy to learn, and since both are such fundamental parts of website architecture, it is better to begin by learning HTML and CSS first before moving on to server-side scripting or JavaScript. Typically, people tend to learn HTML first and then learn parts of CSS along the way. As they are getting at ease with it, they might start tackling some of CSS's more advanced concepts. While this approach is pretty standard, the importance of the relationship between the structure of HTML documents and how they are styled with CSS often gets lost along the way. Let's take a moment to discuss how CSS works with the HTML structure in the hopes that it'll help you write more efficient CSS. Now remember that to style your documents, you'll need to write selectors that target those elements. It should go without saying that if you don't have efficient logical HTML code, it's considerably more difficult to write efficient CSS. CSS works with the structure of your HTML code, allowing the browser to analyze the HTML code, find the right element, and style it accordingly. Having a well-structured, consistent HTML and being familiar with that structure makes it a lot easier to write the CSS for it. There are some best practices that you can follow when authoring HTML and how this can impact your CSS. Firstly, don't use classes and ID attributes arbitrarily. You can see in the example, here the author has used classes and IDs to define styling for each of the individual elements. As you can imagine, there are corresponding selectors in the CSS that define the element styling. In terms of functionality, this example would work, but in terms of proper HTML structure, it has serious problems. HTML should help define your content and give it meaning. Take this class, red text. By itself, it means nothing. This is one of the major mistakes new web designers make. They rely heavily on classes and IDs, and they end up with a considerable amount of unnecessary markup that's hard to maintain or update. Classes and IDs should be descriptive, and they should be used to add meaning to your markup. Take a look at the updated version of our example. Several of the classes and IDs have been replaced with descriptive values, and in other places, they've been removed altogether. In fact, this structure can be styled with fewer CSS than before. The descriptive ID and class names also allows us to get a much clearer picture of exactly what we're styling in our document as well. You might want to make sure your HTML is structured consistently across your site. New authors often structure the same content in different ways on different pages. This makes it considerably more difficult to write global styles for the entire site. Take this pull quote, for example. To style this consistently across the site, you need several different rules that are essentially doing exactly the same thing. By establishing a guideline for how content should be structured and then making sure you're consistent. Following those guidelines, you can make the process of writing styles much easier for yourself. Write your HTML so that you're giving clean, efficient structure to your content. Try to structure the code so that you're adding meaning to the content without even thinking about the styling. It is sometimes difficult for new designers and somewhat counterintuitive, as many visual designers code their pages with styling in mind. Remember, HTML's purpose is to provide structure for your content that helps to convey meaning. If you are able to do this for your content, you'll find that you end up with leaner, more descriptive code that is a lot easier to style. It also means that you'll find yourself having to modify your code for styling purposes much less frequently, if ever at all. CSS styles can be found in 3 different areas. Firstly, as an external style. You can position all CSS styles in their own separate CSS file. This is referred to as an external style sheet. The CSS file is a simple text file with a .css extension. As with HTML, you can use a basic text editor to code the file with, or use a specified website development program. Generally, the external style sheet will hold styles that are designed to control an entire site or a part of a site. You apply these styles to a HTML page by using a link tag in the head of a document. By using the link tag, you can also specify what type of media you would like to apply the styles to, giving you a way to apply different sets of styles to printers, desktops, and mobile devices. Using external style sheets is the most economic and competent manner in applying styles across an entire site. In fact, it has become the industry preference and is encouraged among all developers and designers. A second way in which you can place a CSS rule is directly in between the head tags of a HTML document. This is referred to as an embedded style. Embedded styles can only influence the HTML page that they are nested in, and not site-wide the way external styles can be applied. It does, however, make them an ideal in spotting styles specific to that page. You can also apply styles to a specific HTML element, which is then referred to as an inline CSS style. The syntax on inline styles are cumbersome. You begin with the style attribute followed by a semicolon, which separates the list of CSS rules. Inline styles are ineffective and can be very difficult to override or maintain, and therefore it is discouraged as a practice. Editing an inline style requires you to track down the element that the style is applied to and edit the HTML code directly. This can be even more difficult if you need to update another developer's code. Then you have no indication of knowing where the styles are located, and you'll have to read through pages and pages of HTML documents to find it. Inline styles aren't used by web developers anymore. The only exception is in HTML emails, where all the email clients offer weaker CSS support. You will use the practice of external style sheets with an occasional exception of an embedded style used to override a global style. It is important to keep in mind that you approach web design in a modular fashion. That allows flexibility and control of CSS, and external style sheets are the most effective way to achieve that. The styles themselves and the pages they influence can become fairly complex. As the size of the CSS style sheet becomes larger and more complex, it becomes more difficult to hinder the styles from conflicting with one another. This can lead to excessive code, ineffective CSS, or styles that don't have any influence on the HTML document whatsoever. In order to confidently navigate a more intricate page structure, you need to understand how browsers apply styles. Let's delve into the concept of the cascade. Cascading style sheets receive their name from the cascading order of styles that they're applied to within the browser. This usually means that external styles are applied first, then followed by embedded styles, and lastly, inline styles are applied. If there is any conflict among the styles, the most recent style will overwrite the earlier styles. This principle is also valid among CSS rules. The last rule applied wins. Inheritance grants us the ability to write efficient styles. It can become arduous if we don't remember exactly how styles are structured. Inheritance refers to the ability of child elements to inherit the properties set for parent elements. The box model refers to the physical properties of an element's rectangular box. These consist of margins, borders, padding, as well as content, width, and height. All of the above contribute to the size of the element and also how it relates to other elements in the HTML page. Some things to take into consideration when using the box model are: 1. Never assume the value of a property is naught when it is not declared. Elements often have default margin that you need to account for. For example, a 100% width property combined with padding and borders will create elements that are larger than the parent element it is nested inside. When you begin to structure the layout of the page using CSS, you will begin to understand the power of the box model. Let's examine the properties further. Padding is the component of the box model that defines the space between an element's content and its box. You can specify individual properties, such as padding top, or you can use shorthand notation. Borders add a decorative effect to the box model and are very versatile as a design element. Borders can be specified according to their width, style, and color. The same as with padding, you can specify each side individually, but where possible, it is best practice to use the shorthand notation. Border styles can be set in one of 10 values: solid, dotted, dashed, double, groove, inset, outset, and none, or hidden. Initially, you'll probably only use solid, dotted, or dashed values the most. The outset border styles effect is only visible in settings of pixel widths of more than 1. The color of the border can be specified independently of the foreground and background color. The syntax rule will look as follows. Take note of the American spelling of color. Remember, CSS is case sensitive and you will have to type color in American English. Otherwise, CSS won't recognize it. As I've said, the border adds a decorative effect to the box model. And it is also a very effective visual separator between elements in your project layouts. The last property of the box model is the margin. Margins represent the space between the element and it is applied outside edge. Margin values are not calculated as part of an element's total width, but it does affect the amount of space the element takes up on the page or screen. Most elements have a default margin page that you need to account for. It can be very frustrating when you don't understand why the element isn't positioned the way you intended it, when you forget about that fact. The syntax for margins functions the same as with padding, as you will see in this example shown. Playing around with the background area of elements allow for a creative resource in any layout. The background area extends all the way to the inside edge of an element's border. By default, backgrounds are transparent, and when not specified, will inherit the color of the parent element. By specifying a background fill, you can add a solid color or gradient behind the content within the element, or even an image. When you insert a background image, you can control its position within the element, whether or not it repeats. And you can determine which axis it will repeat to. It is also possible to specify the background image size and whether it will be clipped or appear in full. With the introduction of CSS3, it is also now possible to combine the background color with the background image. Whenever you want to indicate the color value of an element, there are 3 ways of achieving that. The first is color keywords. HTML have only 10 color keywords, but since CSS3, CSS boasts a range of 150 different color keywords. Where this is definitely the easiest way to remember, the other 2 methods are more rewarding since it covers the whole range of screen colors, which are vastly more than 150. In HTML, a color can also be specified as an RGB value using this formula, red, green, and blue, as they are the primary colors of the additive color model used for screen display of colors. Each parameter, red, green, and blue, defines the intensity of the color between 0 and 255. For example, RGB in between brackets 255, 0, 0 is displayed as red because red is set to its highest value, being 255, and the others are set to 0. To display the color black, all color parameters must be set to 0, like this. RGB 0, 0, 0. To display the color white, all color parameters must be set to 255, like this. RGB 255, 255, 255, in between brackets. Apart from using the integer values, percentages can also be used, such as RGB in between brackets 100%, 50%, 0%. And thirdly, a color can also be specified using a hexadecimal value in the form of pound, $R, $G, $B, where $R is red, $G green, and $B blue. And the hexadecimal values are between 00 and FF. For example, pound FF 000 is displayed as red because red is set to its highest value, FF, and the others are set to the lowest value, 00. While this may sound foreign, there are many color picker websites available to help you identify the hexadecimal value. Or you can use a software image program such as Photoshop. Since CSS3, the latest version of CSS, the use of HSL is also introduced as another way of defining color. It is short for hue, saturation, and lightness. Hue, defined from 0 to 360, defines the type of color. Saturation, from 0 to 100%, none to full saturation. And lightness, from 0 to 100%, from light to black, being 100. Whichever method you choose in defining your color scheme, remain consistent with the choice. For example, if the first color is defined using a keyword, then all colors used within that project should be defined with keywords. It is also possible to set the opacity of an element's color. The value of opacity is declared from 0 to 1, 0 being invisible and 1 being completely opaque. Opacity applies to all aspects of an element's properties. The borders, backgrounds, and content all share the same amount of transparency. Websites are designed for a screen, and therefore the values used for measurement are relative. This means their value is calculated in relation to another property. The types you'll use the most are pixels, ems, and percentage. The pixel, a word invented from picture element, is the basic unit of programmable color on a computer display or in a computer image. Pixels are relative in size to the screen's resolution. Ems is used mainly when referring to a font size. When used with the font size, 1 em is equal to the default font size for the device. For example, if the browser's default font size is set to times 16 point, then 1 em equals 16 pixels. Most beginners prefer to use pixels as a unit of measurement, as ems can be difficult to calculate when you are not familiar with the default browser's preferences. Percentage values can also be used. Percentage values are calculated relative to their parent element. A div with a width of 80% would use 80% of its parent element, while a paragraph with its font size set to 80% would size the text at 80% of the size of its parent text. Let's take a break before we continue with Unit 3B.